You walk into a coffee shop, order a drip coffee that took 30 seconds to pour, and swipe your credit card. The screen swivels toward you. It offers 3 options, 15%, 20%, and 25%. The barista is watching. You're not sitting down. No one brought you anything. But you tap 20% anyway, because tapping anything less feels like an insult. A $3 coffee is now $3.60, and you've just participated in one of the most successful behavioral pricing shifts in American retail history. Tipping in America wasn't always like this. For most of the 20th century, the standard tip was 10%. In the 1980s, restaurants started suggesting 15%. By the 2010s, 20% had become the expected minimum for sit-down service. Then something changed after COVID, and it wasn't just generosity. The same point-of-sale systems that processed your payment started asking you a question that had never been asked in a coffee shop, a takeout counter, or a self-serve frozen yogurt shop before. And once the screen started asking, the social pressure to say yes became nearly impossible to resist. The economics of this shift are fascinating because they don't follow normal market logic. In a normal market, when more workers enter an industry, wages fall. When fewer workers are available, wages rise. Tipping should follow the same pattern. But it doesn't. Tipping percentages have risen steadily regardless of labor market conditions, minimum wage changes, or restaurant profitability. The reason is that tipping isn't really a market transaction. It's a social norm dressed up as a market transaction, and social norms are engineered, not discovered. The engineering happened in 3 waves. Wave 1 was the point-of-sale terminal. Companies like Square, Toast, and Clover realized that their software could suggest tip amounts, and the results were immediate. A coffee shop that added a tip screen saw tip frequency go from near 0 to over 60%. The suggested amounts, 15-20-25 rather than October 15, 20, anchored customers to higher numbers. Customers who would have tipped $1 now tipped $1.50 because the screen reframed the math from absolute dollars to percentages. A 20% tip on a $5 latte is only $1, but compared to the old default of 0, it was pure additional revenue. Wave 2 was the pandemic. In 2020, service workers were recast as essential frontline heroes, and tipping became a form of moral signaling. Tipping percentages jumped almost overnight from an average of 17% to 21% as customers felt social pressure to demonstrate their support for workers risking their health. This shift would have been temporary in a normal recovery, except it coincided with Wave 3, the digitization of casual dining. Fast casual restaurants had already eliminated waitstaff in favor of counter ordering. Now the counter had a tip screen, and there was no waitstaff to tip, but the screen didn't make that distinction. It just asked. The result is what economists now call tipflation. Since 2019, the average tip percentage at full-service restaurants has risen from 18.5% to 21.8%. At quick-service restaurants and coffee shops, where tipping was previously rare, the percentage of transactions that include a tip has risen from 17% to 48%. The pool of tip transactions has more than doubled. American consumers now leave an estimated $50 billion in tips annually, up from $35 billion in 2019. That's $15 billion in new consumer spending that isn't tracked well in inflation statistics, isn't taxed reliably, and isn't distributed according to any transparent wage structure. The business model behind tipflation is elegantly simple. Restaurants save on labor costs because tipped workers can legally be paid as little as $2.13 per hour under federal law, with tips expected to bring them up to minimum wage. When tips increase, the restaurant's labor cost doesn't change, but the worker's effective wage goes up. The customer bears the entire increase. This creates a perverse incentive structure where restaurants benefit from tipflation because it makes their jobs more attractive to workers without increasing their costs. Customers pay more without realizing it because tips feel voluntary, and workers' incomes become unpredictable and dependent on customer psychology rather than employer compensation. The pushback is building slowly. Some restaurants have experimented with no tipping policies, raising menu prices 20% and paying workers flat wages. Union Square Hospitality Group, Danny Meyer's restaurant group, famously eliminated tipping in 2015, then quietly brought it back in 2020 when the pandemic made tipping seem more generous than a service charge. The distinction between a mandatory 20% service charge and a 20% tip is functionally zero, but psychologically, customers hate service charges and tolerate tips. The modern point-of-sale tip screen exploits this psychological distinction perfectly. Figuring out whether tipflation will continue comes down to asking a single question. Can you say no to the screen? Every transaction tests the social norm, and every time someone taps 20% because it's easier than doing math at the register, the norm gets stronger. The screen isn't going away. Neither is the social pressure. The only question is whether customers will eventually develop tip screen immunity, or whether 25% will be the new normal 5 years from now.